Americans are leaving California and New York in droves. People are getting fed up and moving to Arizona, Nevada, Texas, or Florida, and the main reason why is money. For the first time ever, the housing market is being cut in half. That's right, brand new data just confirmed that national housing prices are both crashing and surging at the exact same time, depending on where you live, and remarkably, something like this has never happened before. Not to mention, in the middle of all of this, housing prices just broke a decade-long streak. California passed a new housing tax that will deliver the hardest hit to the market since 2007, and a brand new proposal could wind up costing you a lot more money, especially since Social Security is running out sooner than expected. So that's why we got to break down exactly what's going on, which markets are seeing the biggest price cuts, why you should not be buying a home in California. As you can see, all the celebrities, including Brad Pitt, have sold their house in California already. And then finally, what you could do about all of this to save a little bit of money on today's episode. Alright, so first we have to talk about what's happening in the housing market, because I gotta say, it's rather surprising on a broad scale. Yes, it's true that prices are coming down. In fact, as you can see in the Case-Shiller Index, prices are already 5% lower than they were back in June of 2022. But this also marks a very rare occurrence where prices are officially lower year over year. Yes, you heard that correctly. The last time this happened was all the way back in 2012, right after the great financial crisis, and one of the main culprits leading to these lower prices isn't so much higher interest rates, but instead more inventory. Seeing even though fewer sellers are listing their properties, the ones that do are facing 60% more competition than they had a year ago, since old listings are no longer selling. Just consider it like this: if 10 new listings are coming on the market every month and 10 are selling, inventory would stay the same and prices would remain neutral. But now, if 8 new listings are coming on the market every month and only 5 are selling, then you have fewer new listings at the same time that more inventory is building up, prompting some sellers to begin reducing the price. That's pretty much what's happening here. See, even though new listings in March were nearly 30% below pre-pandemic levels, inventory has increased 59.9% compared to the year prior. But that's still dramatically lower than what we've seen in the past, suggesting that some areas could actually continue going higher. As Black Knight Research pointed out, the entire housing market has pretty much been cut in half, right down the middle, with the West Coast having seen a 10% drop, while the East Coast saw a 10% gain. If you live in New York or Miami, let me know in the comment section below. In terms of the specifics, home prices fell 7.5% in Seattle and dropped 10.3% in San Francisco. At the same time, home prices surged 12% in Miami and jumped 9.3% in Orlando. Why is this happening? Well, as you can see, the areas that decline just so happen to be the most exactly aligned with the areas that have the highest prices, and the opposite applies to those which saw home prices increase. Basically, higher priced houses have had more room to fall or have seen more of a net migration to the locations with more affordable housing. It's no surprise, since more people are working online and becoming digital, there is no point of paying sky-high prices in Los Angeles, where basically $1 million just gets you a rundown shack. Although one state in particular is about to see even more of a homebuyer exodus, and that would be none other than the Golden State, California. Beginning April 1st, Los Angeles residents will be subject to an additional 4 to 5.5% tax on all properties sold over $5 million, and this is expected to completely destroy the high-end property market through the entire state, potentially resulting in even more people leaving. There's going to be a lot of selling going on, especially from the high-end market, and these celebrities are getting out really fast. So here's the deal. What's known as a transfer tax is usually paid by the seller anytime a property changes ownership. In Los Angeles, the transfer tax was about 0.45% of the sales price, with money usually going back into the county. However, that was until, of course, Measure ULA went into effect. This is a new plan that was established to fund affordable housing and provide resources for the homeless by enacting a 4 to 5.5% tax on the sales price of every property sold over $5 million. And the long-term effects of this are said to be disastrous. Of course, for those unaware, here's a bit of background. Homelessness is a serious issue throughout California, which is occupied by more than half of all unsheltered people in the country. In fact, California spent $10 billion between 2018 and 2021 trying to solve the issue. But the number of those living on the street continued to rise despite California soon becoming the 4th largest economy in the entire world. In this case though, a 4 to 5.5% transfer tax is expected to raise $672 million for affordable housing, and it's not just applicable to Los Angeles. The problem though comes from the fact that California's 1% currently pay more than half of the state's income tax, and as of late, a lot of them are leaving, and that's a huge problem. I don't really blame them. The CEO of the California Taxpayer Association even said that the top 5% of income earners pay 70% of the personal income tax. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with people making a high income and maybe having some tax along the way, but there is a problem when those high income folks no longer want to pay the taxes. So, if even a few of those taxpayers rethink California as a place to live, that does have an impact on the state's budget in terms of the housing market. Even though people hear mansion tax and assume that it only applies to A-list actors, athletes, and hedge fund managers. In reality, it's mainly going to affect the construction of multifamily and commercial buildings because of 5% tax, and the entire amount can often equate to more than half of a builder's overall profit margin. People don't really realize this, but even a company like Amazon, Walmart, these companies have razor-thin margins. In fact, Amazon only has a couple percentage points of profit. So if you end up raising taxes or changing the profit margin by 1 or 2%, that could make a billion or $1 trillion company have essentially zero profits. And that's why this is such a dangerous tax to implement, especially in California, which has a very fragile real estate market. This means that there's even less incentive now for investors to add more housing supply into the market. This is going to affect not only builders, but also people looking for housing. Businesses will be less inclined to expand, and this only gives more of a reason for people to leave. On top of that, it is said that the new tax would apply to the entirety of the sale consideration, not solely the amount in excess of the $5 or $10 million thresholds. And regardless of whether the property is sold at a gain or a loss, this means that a property that sells for $4 million will not have to pay the additional tax, while a property that sells for $1 more will have to pay a $225,000 fee. It just makes absolutely no sense. I think this measure affects the entirety of California because even though this currently only applies to the largest cities, the expectation is that the dollar amount would very well be lowered, and there's nothing stopping them from applying this throughout the entire state. So it's a pretty scary time for homeowners in California, even if you don't live in the major city. On top of that, there's really no logic in applying the tax of the entire amount. It would be no different than the IRS saying, if you make more than $44,726, all of the income will be taxed at 22%. No tax system works like that, and generally, it's only the tax above the amount that applies. This is called incremental tax, not the whole amount. That would be absolutely insane. That's exactly what California is doing. That would be like the equivalent of me making $1,001 and all of a sudden my tax bracket goes up to 60%, but it's applied to everything. Then I would just try to make $999,999 and I would never make $2 extra. This unfortunately is not the case. It seems like a whole misguided attempt to solve a problem by simply throwing more money at it versus solving the core issue, which in my opinion is simply a lack of accountability through all statewide spending. It's kind of like spending $100 billion on a high-speed rail that went nowhere. If instead California spent more money prioritizing mental health or addiction, I think they go a lot further than raising taxes on people who are more likely to leave. But speaking of that, there is another topic that's most likely going to have a direct impact on you, and that's what brings us to the brand new proposal to raise taxes. Let me explain. As it stands right now, the United States is quickly running out of money, with the national debt approaching $32 trillion. Now typically, this isn't much of a concern when interest rates are low, and you could pretty much borrow as much money as you want for free. But with rapidly rising rates, the United States is beginning to pay a lot more in interest, roughly $1 trillion a year to be exact. And that is a problem, especially when costs are only expected to go higher. So as a way to pay for national debt, a new proposal could cut the deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years, and it's most likely going to have an effect on you. First, in one way or another, this would increase the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%, raising $1.3 trillion. As they say, this would still be lower than 35% tax that was established before the two 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Acts. But it would ensure that companies pay their fair share at a slightly higher tax rate than what we're currently seeing. In terms of the potential repercussions of this, a Tax Foundation analysis found that a 20% corporate tax rate would reduce GDP by 0.7% or $160 billion. In the process, stocks and wages would marginally decline, and 138,000 full-time jobs would be lost. Thankfully, they believe the loss would be gradual, but it could result in a GDP decline of $720 billion over the next 10 years, which is larger than the tax revenue that would be generated in its place. As a result, they believe that long-term higher corporate tax would result in incomes dropping by 1.5% to 2%. So overall, this 28% tax is probably not the most effective at generating revenue, but it's still lower than it used to be. However, just consider this. If you made a $1,000 investment and over time that grows to $5,000, you don't have to pay tax on that $4,000 of profit because you haven't locked it in and realized those gains by selling. After all, your investments could just as easily decline in value the next day. So until you click the sell, those profits are not guaranteed in this case. However, they want to do the complete opposite of this. They want to tax the unrealized capital gains and those worth more than $100 million, which would not only be impossible to implement, but imagine being forced to sell shares to pay a tax on an investment you weren't planning to sell to begin with. To add to that, you also have the narrative that they're currently only paying an 8% tax, which is only true in relation to their overall net worth, which is largely already taxed to begin with. It would be kind of like saying someone with $1 million net worth only pays a 10% tax, assuming they pay 50% tax on their $200,000 income. But on a more practical level, taxing unrealized capital gains is going to be an impossible task. The Supreme Court previously ruled that under the 16th Amendment, there must be some actual transfer of rights before Congress could tax appreciation as income, and it'll be a massive waste of resources for everybody involved if they decide to move forward on this. However, there are a few other proposals that do have a much higher chance of passing. One of them would increase the 3.8% Affordable Care Tax Act to 5% on Americans that earn more than $400,000. Second, they would also close the loophole that allows people to bypass the tax by running their income through an LLC or separate corporation. And third, the plan would increase the top tax bracket from 37% back to 39.6%, where it stood prior to 2017. This is probably the most realistic outcome since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is set to expire everywhere in 2025, so the taxes are going up either way. Plus, for anybody currently in the tax bracket, the extra 2.9% is probably going to be unnoticed. And finally, fourth, they would quadruple the stock buyback tax from 1% to 4%. For those unaware of what this is, it's essentially when publicly traded companies have excess capital, they could use that money to buy back their stock, raising its value. However, critics argue that the money should be spent back on their employees' growth and other public services, not enriching their shareholders. But I do believe that stock buybacks can be a good use of capital. For example, there are cases where companies' stock are beaten down and trade below their true value. In that case, buybacks give the company the opportunity to capitalize on this, giving them an almost risk-free guaranteed return. On top of that, a Tax Foundation analysis found that when a company has more cash on that hand than they could reasonably use, they either hold on to it or they return it to shareholders. In this case, companies make investments and growth decisions within the company first and then buy back shares afterward with only what's left over. So I doubt this is really going to be something worth pursuing. However, we do have another tax proposal that's pretty much the exact opposite of this, and that would be the Fair Tax Act. This proposal suggests that income taxes slow economic growth, hampers our ability to be competitive as a country, reduces investment, lowers productivity, and impedes our ability to socially move upward. So a better solution would simply be a flat tax on consumption, not incompetence. If that sounds confusing, let me explain. Instead of paying 20 to 50% tax on all of your income, you would simply pay a flat 30% sales tax on all of your purchases, which raises the question, what if you're currently living paycheck paycheck to paycheck. So everything you buy suddenly costs 30% more? Well, they thought about that and they solved the problem by sending out rebates that could help cover the additional sales tax for lower income individuals. Although in terms of my thoughts on this would certainly reward people with high income who don't like to spend a lot of money, but would end up costing everyone else a lot more. Not to mention, a 2004 study found that the United States was to replace its current tax system with a sales tax. The rate would have to be as high as 60% to bring in the same amount of money as we are currently. Any lower and we'd likely plunge even deeper into national debt, which was the entire reason the tax was enacted in the first place. Again, as much as I'd be open to a flat income tax, the chance of this one passing is non-existent, and to a certain degree, I'm rather perplexed how anyone could waste time writing this or even consider it as an option. The way I see it, the whole thing is completely pointless. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Are you for it? Are you against it? Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? Thanks again. I'll see you in the next one.